The house was quiet as I stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board usually soothed me, but tonight my thoughts were louder than the sound. My son, Adam, had been withdrawn since returning home 3 weeks ago. His laughter, once a melody that brightened the house, had faded into something quiet and burdened. He had been dating his girlfriend, Sarah, for 2 years, and I thought they were perfect together. The way they moved around each other, finishing each other's sentences, sharing inside jokes. It was the kind of love I had once had with his father, Chris. That was until Adam found out Sarah had been unfaithful. I remembered the day he came home. His eyes hollow, his words clipped. I didn't press him for details then. I knew he needed space to heal. But it was becoming clear that he was not finding his way back to himself. "Adam," I called softly from the doorway. He was slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone, the glow from the screen reflecting on his tired face. "Dinner's almost ready." He glanced at me, his eyes meeting mine briefly before nodding. "I'm not that hungry, Mom. Just sit with me then," I said, walking over to him. "I miss talking to you." He sighed but set his phone down. That was a small victory. As we sat at the dinner table, the silence stretched long. I tried to fill it with small talk, updates on neighbors, work stories, but Adam was distant. He poked at his food, his appetite as absent as his energy. Finally, I ventured carefully into the territory I knew I shouldn't avoid. "How are you holding up?" he asked. He shrugged. "I'm fine." "That doesn't sound fine to me," I said gently. "You don't have to keep it all inside, you know." For a moment, I thought he wouldn't respond. But then he set down his fork, running a hand through his hair. "I don't get it, Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "I gave her everything and she just threw it away. Like I didn't matter." I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know how much she meant to you." He nodded, swallowing hard. "What's the point of loving someone if they're just going to hurt you?" I wanted to tell him it wasn't always like that. That love could be beautiful and lasting, but the words felt hollow in my throat. Chris and I had been together for 25 years, but even our marriage had started to fray at the edges. A pang of guilt tugged at me. I hadn't told Adam or anyone that Chris had been acting strangely. Late nights at work, guarded phone calls, and a new scent lingering on his shirts. I had dismissed my suspicions as paranoia at first, but the signs were too glaring to ignore. That night, after Adam retreated to his room, I waited for Chris to come home. The hours ticked by, and my unease grew heavier with each passing minute. When he finally walked through the door, his tie loosened and his shirt slightly wrinkled, I knew. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He paused, surprised to see me still awake. "Working late." "Why?" I stood, folding my arms. "Don't lie to me, Chris. Who is she?" He froze, the mask slipping just for a second before he regained his composure. "What are you talking about?" "You're cheating on me," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't deny it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think, Anna. Don't you dare patronize me," I snapped, my hurt spilling over. "You've been distant, evasive." "I'm not blind." Chris sat down, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of his deceit had finally caught up with him. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" I laughed bitterly. "We've built a life together, Chris. Family. And you," my voice broke and I turned away, unable to finish the sentence. For the first time in years, I felt completely untethered. I had poured everything into our family, into making our home a sanctuary, and now the foundation was crumbling beneath me. I thought of Adam upstairs, already struggling to believe in love again, and my heart broke for him. How could I explain this to him when I couldn't even make sense of it myself? Chris didn't say much more that night. He left me in the living room, staring at the darkened window. The next morning, Adam came into the kitchen, bleary-eyed but more present than he'd been in weeks. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, grabbing a cup of coffee. I smiled weakly, trying to hold the pieces of myself together for his sake. Morning. He studied me for a moment. You okay? I hesitated, then nodded. I'm just tired. It wasn't a lie. I was tired of pretending, of holding the family together on my own. But I wasn't ready to burden Adam with the truth. Not yet. Later that day, as I folded laundry, Adam came and sat beside me. Thanks for everything, Mom, he said quietly. I looked at him, surprised. For what? For being here, he said. For caring. It means more than you know. I pulled him into a hug, grateful for the connection we still shared. Even as everything else fell apart, I knew I had to be his anchor. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild. A Fractured Horizon, Part 2. The divorce was inevitable. Once the truth was out, there was no going back. Chris moved out a month after I confronted him, leaving behind a trail of half-hearted apologies and empty promises that did nothing to soothe the wounds he had caused. The house felt different without him. Quiet, yes, but also lighter, like the air wasn't weighed down by secrets anymore. It was just me and Adam now, navigating the aftermath of broken trust. First, he was angry, not just at his father but at the world. The betrayal he'd experienced with Sarah seemed to mirror what he saw between Chris and me, amplifying his cynicism. You knew, he said one evening, his tone sharp as he sat across from me at the dinner table. Didn't you? Paused, setting down my fork. Adam, you must have seen it, he pressed, his frustration boiling over. The way Dad acted. How could you not? I did, I admitted softly. But sometimes when you've built a life with someone, you tell yourself it's not real. You hope you're wrong. I didn't want to believe it. His expression softened, though his eyes were still shadowed with hurt. It's just messed up. For Sarah, now this. I don't know if I'll ever trust anyone again. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. It's okay to feel that way. But don't let this make you bitter. There are good people out there, Adam. I know it's hard to believe right now, but trust can be rebuilt. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he nodded, though he didn't look convinced. As the weeks turned into months, we settled into a new rhythm. Adam took a semester off from college, choosing to stay home and help me with the house. At first, I worried it was his way of avoiding life, but as time went on, I realized he needed this time to heal. Our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't expected. Without Chris around, the dynamic between us shifted. We spent more time together, cooking, gardening, watching old movies. He confided in me more than he ever had before, sharing his fears, his dreams, and even his frustrations with the world. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a nature documentary, he turned to me suddenly. You're different now, Mom, he said. I raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. Different how? You just seem freer. Like you're not carrying the weight of everything anymore. I laughed softly, though the observation hit deeper than he probably realized. Maybe I am. It's strange, isn't it? How losing something can make you feel lighter. He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on the screen. I'm glad we have this time, though. Just as. Me too, I said, and I meant it. The days continued to blend together, and with each passing one, the bond between Adam and me grew stronger. He started opening up about his breakup with Sarah in ways he hadn't before. It wasn't just the cheating, he said one evening as we sat in the backyard, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. It was how she made me feel, like I wasn't enough. Like no matter what I did, it didn't matter. My heart ached for him. Adam, listen to me, I said, my voice firm. Her actions say everything about her and nothing about you. You are more than enough. You always have been. He looked at me, his eyes glistening. You really believe that? Of course I do, I said, pulling him into a hug. And one day, you'll find someone who sees you the way I do. His grip tightened around me, and for the first time in months, I felt like he was beginning to heal. There was an intimacy to our relationship now, one built on shared pain and mutual understanding. It wasn't just a mother and son dynamic anymore. It was a partnership, a team. We leaned on each other in ways we hadn't before, and it made me realize how much I had taken him for granted when life had been simpler. Still, there were moments when the closeness felt almost too intense. Like the time we spent an entire Sunday repainting the living room, laughing as we splattered paint on each other. Or the nights when he would rest his head on my shoulder as we watched TV, a gesture that felt too tender for the growing man he was becoming. I didn't question it, though. We were both healing, finding comfort in each other's presence. And if sometimes that comfort felt more profound than it should, I told myself it was just the result of everything we'd been through. But deep down I wondered, was this what closeness looked like, or had the fractures in our lives created something else entirely? Time would tell. For now, I was content to hold on to the connection we had rebuilt, even as I navigated the complicated feelings it sometimes brought with it. The changes were subtle at first. Small gestures that felt like Adam's way of expressing his gratitude for everything we'd been through together. He was always considerate, but lately it had become more pronounced. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store to find the house unusually quiet. Setting the bags on the counter, I called out, "Adam? You home?" "In here, Mom," his voice echoed from the living room. I walked in and froze. On the coffee table was a vase with a bouquet of flowers, delicate pink and white roses arranged with care. "For you," he said, standing nearby with a sheepish grin. "What's this for?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You deserve it. You've been holding everything together for us. I thought you might like a little surprise." Emotion swelled in my chest as I approached the bouquet, touching the soft petals. "They're beautiful, Adam. Thank you." As I turned to him, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to my cheek. "You're amazing, you know that?" His words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I reached up, brushing a hand across his face as though to ground myself. "And you're a good man. I hope you know that." He smiled, but there was something in his expression, an intensity that made me feel warm and exposed all at once. The days that followed were filled with little moments like that. Adam became more attentive, offering to help with chores I hadn't even asked him to do. He brought me tea in the mornings when he noticed I was particularly tired. He made sure I was comfortable when I curled up with a book in the evenings, even draping a blanket over my shoulders without a word. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, he complimented me in a way that left me momentarily speechless. "You're glowing lately," he said casually, glancing at me from where he was sprawled out beside me. I blinked at him, unsure of what to say. "Glowing?" "Yeah," he said, leaning his head against the back of the couch. "I don't know, you just look really beautiful these days. Happier, I guess." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You're sweet, but I think your standards are a little low." "I'm serious, Mom," he said, his tone sincere. "You're incredible. You've always been, but I think I'm just realizing it more now." His words hung in the air, and I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze. "Thank you, Adam. That means a lot." It wasn't just his words, though. It was the way he said them. His voice carrying a depth that lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. One Sunday afternoon, we decided to clean out the garage, a long overdue task that neither of us had been looking forward to. As we sifted through boxes of old memories, we laughed over photos from Adam's childhood and shared stories about moments we had almost forgotten. At one point he paused, holding up a picture of the three of us, me, Chris, and a young Adam, standing in front of a park fountain. "We were happy then," he said quietly, a note of wistfulness in his voice. "We were," I agreed, resting a hand on his shoulder. "But happiness isn't confined to one moment, Adam. It's something we can find again, even if it looks different." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You always know what to say." That evening, after dinner, he brought out a bottle of wine. "To us," he said, raising his glass. "To us," I echoed, clinking mine against his. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned lighter, our laughter filling the room in a way that made the house feel alive again. But there was a moment when Adam reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. It was such a small gesture, but the weight of it lingered. You know, he said softly, I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom. I smiled, squeezing his hand. And you won't have to find out. The closeness between us had become undeniable, a warmth that went beyond the boundaries of our usual relationship. And though I didn't want to admit it, there was a part of me that found comfort in the way Adam looked at me, in the way his care made me feel seen and cherished. But along with that comfort came a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, a feeling that made my heart race whenever his gaze lingered a second too long or when his touch felt more tender than usual. For now I tried to tell myself it was nothing. After all, we were simply two people healing together, finding solace in each other's presence. But deep down, I knew the line between what was and what could be was becoming harder to define. The glow of the fireplace filled the living room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Adam and I sat on the plush rug, a bottle of wine between us, the soft crackle of the fire the only sound breaking the stillness. It had become something of a tradition, these quiet evenings where we'd sit and talk, letting the warmth of the flames and the intimacy of the space draw us closer. Adam poured the last of the wine into our glasses, leaning back against the couch. His face was illuminated by the firelight, his expression calm but contemplative. You're too good for him, you know, he said suddenly, his voice low but firm. I looked at him, startled by the intensity in his tone. What do you mean? Dad, he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. He never deserved you. Adam, I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off. No, let me say this, he insisted, turning to face me fully. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. The way he treated you, the lying, the cheating. It's unforgivable. You gave him everything, and he threw it away like it didn't matter. I opened my mouth to respond but found that I couldn't. His words struck a chord deep within me, echoing thoughts I had buried in the weeks since the divorce. You've always been there for everyone, Adam continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. For me, for him, for our family. You held everything together while he took it all for granted. I felt a lump form in my throat as I looked at him. His eyes filled with a mix of anger and something softer. Admiration, maybe. Adam, it's not that simple, I said quietly. Your father wasn't perfect, but we had good times too. He's still your dad. I know, Adam said, his tone softening. And I'll always love him as my father, but that doesn't mean I can ignore what he did to you. You deserve better, Mom. You always have. I reached out, resting a hand on his arm. Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me. His gaze held mine, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. You deserve someone who sees how incredible you are, he said. His voice almost a whisper. Someone who values you for everything you are. Someone who would never hurt you the way he did. The sincerity in his words took my breath away, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. There was a vulnerability in the way he spoke, a raw honesty that felt almost too intimate. Adam, I started, my voice trailing off as emotion overwhelmed me. He reached up, brushing a stray tear from my cheek with a tenderness that made my heart ache. You're stronger than anyone I know, he said. And you're the most beautiful person inside and out. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt a warmth spread through me, not just from the fire but from the way he looked at me, as though I was the most important person in the world. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Adam smiled softly, his hand lingering on my cheek for a moment before he pulled it away. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire, the space between us charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. As the night wore on, we stayed there by the fire, our conversation shifting to lighter topics. But Adam's words stayed with me, replaying in my mind long after we said goodnight and retreated to our separate rooms. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Gratitude, pride, and something else, something I wasn't ready to name.